I was first interested in human rights diplomacy and started to look into quiet diplomacy, so the field that we don't know about, not the public diplomacy, the public statements, public records, etc., but rather what happens behind closed doors. And I noticed in my research on China that individual cases of political detainees played an important role in the American human rights dialogue with China, and also in the European human rights dialogue with China. But we saw, I think, most releases facilitated by American detention. So I started to get interested in individual cases, but primarily also in how, as external actors, we can facilitate their release and how we can make sure that there is no torture and detention. So different actors have defined political prisoners in different terms, and there is correct. There is no internationally agreed by states agreed definition. The only definition that states have agreed on is a relatively recent resolution by the Council of Europe, but that only applies to member states of the Council of Europe. Of course, there are other actors that have defined political detention. For example, most prominently, Amnesty International has been working on political prisoners for a very long time, since, in fact, they were founded in the 1960s. That was to help the forgotten prisoners of the world, and they coined their own term, prisoners of conscience, which is a subcategory of political prisoners. So different actors have defined the term differently. And that we struggled with, because we needed to know for our research who do we include, which individual case do we count as a political prisoner, and which one do we not count. The second struggle there that we had, or the challenge that we faced, was that states who detain people for political purposes have, of course, also learned that it can be costly to detain somebody officially and sentence somebody when the whole world watches. And so we see informal forms of detention also. So people are detained in black sites or an extended period are under house arrest. And we felt such detainees should also be counted. And we shouldn't limit ourselves to cases where, in fact, we have a court decision. We count individual cases of detention where an international actor claims the detention takes place for political purposes. And in fact, we came to realize a lot of countries criminalize their political detainees. They, in fact, give them criminal charges, and when accused of holding political prisoners, they will say no. In fact, these are all prisoners who are sentenced for a crime. So what we see is a struggle between a country that tries to normalize political detention through the justice system and activists and also states that challenge that criminalization. And so we realize you become a political prisoner by attribution. You become recognized as illegitimately detained only if people by name mention you as a political detainee. Well, of course, we want to know what happens around the world. Is political detention becoming worse? Do we see more political prisoners today than we had in the past? Which countries are still holding political prisoners? Or do we see an improvement over time? Because, of course, we have seen quite sustained international attention also from NGO actors to this human rights violation. And we wanted to know what is the effect of all of that detention on the levels of detention. And the existing data didn't really provide us with satisfying answers, so we started developing our own data set. And there, in fact, as you said, since different actors have different definitions, we had to develop an approach of our own. And we started by really looking for individual cases in the public records of three key players, of Amnesty International as the one NGO that has been dedicated to fighting political detention for a long time. Then we also looked at the human rights report, the annual human rights report of the US State Department. The United States government is the most committed state actor to identify individual cases across a very broad range of countries, much more active than the Europeans on this front. And then we had the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. We also wanted to have an actor from the international organizations, and the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention is the only body that is actually mandated to receive individual complaints from detainees and to pass an opinion on the nature of the detention. And so when you get recognized by the working group as arbitrarily detained, that challenges the legitimacy of your detention. And in fact, there is a special category that the working group looks at, category 2, which basically are political prisoners. These are detainees that are held for political reasons. And so here we have 3 actors: an NGO, a state actor, and a body of the United Nations, a special procedure. And we felt that gave us a pretty good range. Of course, these are only 3 actors, but 3 important actors, and a good range to then identify individual cases. And we looked at their reports and at their decisions and recorded individuals by name if our 3 actors framed the detention to be political. So we see that a lot of people are not mentioned, and it's also understandable that there are capacity constraints on Amnesty's behalf, and they do have to fact check, which is very difficult in a country to which they don't have access. And they have also adopted a policy, which I think is an important policy, to only publicize names if they get the person's consent, or if the person is in detention and can't be personally contacted, at least by the lawyer or by the family members. And it has to be informed consent, so the Amnesty has to explain to the family members and the lawyers what they will do with the information, what effect this may have, so that the individuals can take an informed decision. And all that means not every case gets picked up, and especially people who live in remote areas, who do not live in the capital, who are difficult to reach, have a much, much lower chance to be internationally noticed and to be recognized. And so there is a lot more work to be done to identify the political detainees around the world. Yeah, North Korea is an especially hard case. We have good evidence. Amnesty International has presented aerial pictures of the detention sites in North Korea, and this information has made its way into reports of the United Nations. So, the estimate is that there are 200,000 political detainees in North Korea based on these aerial pictures. But in terms of individual names, we hardly know anything. In our database for 10 years, covering 3 international actors, so Amnesty International, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and the US State Department, we were only able to identify 9 names. 9 people out of 200,000. So there's definitely a lot we still don't know. But of course, North Korea is a particularly closed and society, very, very difficult country to work on. Nevertheless, I think in most of the countries that we look at, we have to assume that we don't know every political detainee by name. I think the next major goal must be to get a better understanding of the effect of international attention on conditions of detention and early release. We hear from activists and experts that have been involved in organizations, but also from diplomats, that in their personal experiences they hear a lot of feedback on the positive impact of international attention, that the detainees get treated better in prison, and sometimes that they get released. But we have too little understanding about this process. And I hope that we can contribute to understanding this very important question better. Does international detention facilitate early releases? I think if we can show that quantitatively, it will be also an encouragement to diplomats in particular who sometimes hesitate to get involved because they're worried to make the situation even worse. But this is a major research challenge because we have now mapped the international detention. We have lots of names, almost 8,000, but we still know too little about their detention conditions, about their sentences, about the dates of their release, and we would have to really do thorough research at the level of individual cases.